The night Emily told me about the party, she was glowing. Not in the way she used to when we'd share a quiet night at home or laugh over cheap wine in our cramped first apartment. This was different, electric. Her energy filled the room, her words spilling out in fast bursts about how it was going to be the event of the season, and how she couldn't wait to introduce me to her colleagues. But what struck me most wasn't her enthusiasm. It was the way she avoided looking me in the eye, like she was performing a script she didn't quite believe in. "Make sure you wear your navy suit," she said casually, like she hadn't already picked it out for me. "It's going to be super formal. Oh, and don't forget to bring your A game. These are big players." I remember smiling, even though something about the way she said it stung. When had Emily started speaking to me like I was an accessory she could polish up and display? The party was held at some sleek downtown venue. Lots of glass, dim lights, and bartenders who poured cocktails as if they were mixing potions. Emily was magnetic, her laughter echoing above the hum of polite conversation. People gravitated toward her, like she was the most interesting person in the room. And then there was me, smiling politely, shaking hands with strangers whose names I forgot immediately, all while keeping an eye on my wife. It was during one of those awkward lulls when she wasn't by my side that I first noticed him. A tall man with sharp features and a watch that probably cost more than my car. He was leaning against the bar, watching Emily with an intensity that made my stomach turn. She was across the room, laughing, and it was clear from the way his gaze tracked her movements that this wasn't the first time he'd done it. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was nothing. But then she caught his eye and smiled. Not her usual polite smile, but something softer, intimate, like they shared a secret. I turned away, gripping my glass harder than I meant to, and told myself to relax. This was just work. Networking. She had been looking forward to this for weeks. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. Emily was gone for a while after that, flitting from group to group, her hand grazing mine briefly before she disappeared again. I tried to mingle, tried to play the role of the supportive husband, but my attention kept drifting back to that man. And eventually to the fact that Emily was nowhere to be seen. When she finally reappeared, she was flushed. "Sorry," she said with a laugh, her voice slightly too loud. "Got caught up in a conversation about, I don't even know, work stuff." She waved it off like it didn't matter, but she wouldn't tell me who she'd been talking to. I didn't push. I didn't want to be that guy. But something shifted in the air between us that night. And I knew, without understanding why, that I just crossed into dangerous territory. The morning after the party, I woke up to Emily humming in the kitchen. She was making breakfast, something she rarely did anymore. The smell of coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe everything was fine. Maybe I was the one overthinking. But then I noticed her phone on the counter, face down, vibrating. Once, twice, 3 times in quick succession. I glanced over without meaning to, catching a flash of the contact name before she swept it up like a hawk guarding its prey. "Work call. Early for a Saturday," I said casually, trying to gauge her reaction. "Oh, it's nothing," she replied with that effortless smile she'd perfected. "Just follow-ups from last night. You know how these things go." Did I? I didn't respond, watching as she slid the phone into her back pocket and returned to the stove. Her shoulders seemed tense now, the humming gone, replaced by the rhythmic scrape of a spatula against the pan. That moment set the tone for the next few weeks. Emily became more meticulous about her phone, keeping it on her at all times and angling the screen away if I happened to walk by. She started taking walks after dinner, her phone glued to her ear, talking in hushed tones about deliverables and team dynamics. And then there were the gym sessions. Twice a week turned into 5 times, complete with new leggings and sports bras that still had tags dangling from them when I did the laundry. When I teased her about turning into a fitness junkie, she laughed it off and said, "I just want to feel good about myself again." You know? I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the cracks in her story started to grow. One night, she told me she'd be late because of a team-building dinner with her coworkers. I decided to surprise her, thinking maybe I could turn the night into something fun. I stopped by her favorite Thai place and brought takeout to her office building, imagining how her face would light up when she saw me standing there with her favorite pad CEW. But when I arrived, the receptionist looked confused. Team dinner? I don't think anyone's here, sir. The office closes at 6 on Fridays. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty lobby, the takeout bag growing heavier in my hand. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I waited, watched. A few days later, I noticed a charge on our joint credit card. $112 at a restaurant downtown. The kind of place where a plate of food costs as much as a week's worth of groceries. I asked her about it casually over breakfast. "Oh, that's from the dinner with my team," she said, not missing a beat. We decided to split the bill evenly, even though I barely ate anything. Annoying, right? I nodded, chewing slowly as her words rattled around in my head. She sounded so convincing, but I knew she was lying. That night, I lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep, her breathing soft and even beside me. My mind raced, replaying every small inconsistency, every glance she thought I hadn't noticed, every excuse that didn't quite add up. The doubt wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a scream. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what. The tipping point came sooner than I expected. It was a Tuesday evening, and I had stayed late at work to finish up a project. Emily had texted earlier, saying she was meeting Kara for a yoga class and might grab a smoothie afterward. I should have driven straight home, but something nagged at me, like a splinter buried too deep to ignore. Instead of heading to the house, I found myself driving toward the gym where she said she was. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, save for a few cars scattered under the dim glow of streetlights. I parked far enough away to avoid being seen and waited, my heart thudding in my chest. If this was just paranoia, I'd go home, apologize to myself for being an idiot, and never bring it up again. But then I saw her. Emily stepped out of the gym, but she wasn't alone. The man from the party, the one with the sharp features and the expensive watch, was walking beside her. They weren't touching, but the way they moved, so close and synchronized, sent a chill up my spine. She laughed at something he said, tilting her head in that familiar way that used to be reserved for me. They stopped by his car, a sleek black SUV that looked brand new. She leaned against the passenger door, arms crossed, as he reached into his pocket and handed her something. She slipped it into her bag without hesitation. Could have been harmless. Could have been a key, a receipt, anything. But the way she looked at him afterward, her lips curving into a smile that seemed too private for a public parking lot, told me otherwise. I stayed in the shadows, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to storm over there, demand to know what the hell was going on, but something held me back. Not fear, anger, the kind that burns slow and steady, waiting for the perfect moment to explode. When they finally parted ways, she got into her car and drove off. I followed, careful to keep my distance. She didn't head home, as I expected, but to a small coffee shop on the edge of town. I parked a few spaces down, watching as she went inside and sat at a corner table. Minutes later, the man walked in. He didn't sit across from her. He sat next to her, so close their shoulders touched. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my phone, I snapped a few pictures through the window. They weren't great, blurred and grainy, but they were enough. Enough to prove what my gut had been screaming for weeks. She wasn't where she said she'd be. She wasn't with who she said she'd be with. And she sure as hell wasn't acting like a married woman. I didn't confront her that night. I drove home, my mind buzzing like static. She arrived an hour later, breezing through the door with a casual, "Yoga was great. Gotta says hi." I didn't respond, afraid my voice would betray the storm brewing inside me. I was done doubting, done making excuses. I needed answers, and if Emily wasn't going to give them to me, I'd find them myself. The next morning, Emily was already up when I came downstairs. She was scrolling through her phone at the kitchen counter, sipping her coffee like nothing was wrong. She glanced up with a bright smile when she saw me, the kind that used to melt my heart but now felt rehearsed. "Morning. I'm meeting Kara again tonight for a quick drink, so don't wait up. Okay?" I stared at her for a moment, searching for any flicker of guilt or hesitation. There was nothing, just that same casual confidence she always carried, as though lying had become second nature. "Sure," I said, my voice steady despite the storm churning inside me. That day at work, I couldn't focus. Every email, Every meeting felt like static in the background as I obsessed over what I'd seen the night before. The pictures I'd taken sat in a hidden folder on my phone, taunting me. I'd replayed the scene 100 times in my mind. Her smile, the way she leaned into him, the unspoken intimacy between them. By lunchtime, I made a decision. I couldn't keep playing the fool in my own marriage. If Emily thought she could keep up this charade, she was about to find out otherwise. I started small. I checked our shared bank account and credit card statements during my lunch break, combing through every transaction with a fine-tooth comb. There it was again, the charge for that fancy dinner downtown. Another one for a boutique hotel 2 towns over, listed as conference expense. And yet another, this time at a spa I knew I hadn't been to. My chest tightened as the evidence piled up. But it wasn't enough. I needed more. That evening, I left work early and went to the bar Emily had mentioned. It was a cozy, upscale place she frequented with her friends. Dim lighting, craft cocktails, and a playlist full of trendy hits. I took a seat at the far end of the bar, close enough to see anyone walking in but far enough to stay unnoticed. Sure enough, an hour later, Emily walked in. But she wasn't with Kara. She was with him. They slipped into a booth near the back, partially hidden from view. I strained to watch as he reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned closer, her face lighting up with the same expression she used to save for me. I snapped more pictures, my hands trembling. This time there was no doubt. This wasn't work. This wasn't friendship. This was betrayal, plain and simple. I stayed for almost an hour, long enough to watch them laugh, flirt, and share a plate of appetizers like they were the only 2 people in the world. When they left together, I didn't follow. Couldn't. My chest felt like it had been hollowed out, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Driving home, I kept replaying their faces in my mind. Her smile, his hand on hers, the way she leaned into him like he was her safe place. By the time I walked through the door, I was shaking with rage. Emily was already home, lounging on the couch in sweatpants like she hadn't just been wrapped around another man. "Hey," she said cheerfully. "You're home early. How was your day?" For a moment, I just stared at her, marveling at how easily she slipped into this role. Devoted wife, doting partner, a master of deception. "Fine," I said tightly, turning toward the kitchen. "You?" "Oh, it was good. Kara and I had a blast, as always. She's so funny. You'd love her if you got to know her better." Her lies were like knives now, each one cutting deeper than the last. But I kept my cool, biding my time. This wasn't the moment to strike. No, I wanted her to think she was winning. Because when the truth came out, I wanted it to destroy her as much as she was destroying me. That night, as Emily slept soundly beside me, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. My mind was a storm of anger, pain, and a grim determination to take control of the situation. I couldn't confront her yet. Not without undeniable proof. Not without making sure she couldn't worm her way out with another charming lie. So I decided to set a trap. The next morning, over breakfast, I played my part. I acted casual, warm even, as if nothing was wrong. Emily seemed none the wiser, scrolling through her phone and making plans for another girls' night later in the week. "Sounds like fun," I said, sipping my coffee. "You've been spending a lot of time with Kara lately. When do I get to meet this mystery friend?" She paused for the briefest moment, barely a flicker before laughing. "Oh, you know how it is. Girl talk, lots of gossip. I promise one day soon. Maybe at the next party." It was a masterful deflection, but I didn't push. Instead, I nodded and smiled, letting her believe she'd gotten away with it. Later that day, I took a long lunch break to visit a private investigator I'd found online. The office was nondescript, tucked into a strip mall, but the man who greeted me had the sharp, no-nonsense air of someone who'd seen it all. His name was Frank, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What do you want me to find out?" he asked, leaning back in his chair as he scanned the notes I'd scribbled down. I told him everything. The lies, the strange behaviors, the man I'd seen with her. He didn't flinch, just nodded and jotted down details in a small notebook. "Got it," he said when I finished. "Give me a week, maybe less." When I handed over the deposit, it felt like signing a contract with fate. I had no idea what Frank would uncover, but I knew it would change everything. In the meantime, I couldn't just sit and wait. I needed to keep Emily in the dark. Let her think I was still the oblivious husband she'd been fooling for months. That evening, I suggested we have a date night. A rare thing these days, considering how busy she always claimed to be. She hesitated at first but eventually agreed, her tone light and easy. "Just don't make it one of those boring dinners," she teased. "Let's do something fun." I planned the night meticulously, choosing a lively downtown spot where we could blend into the crowd. Over drinks and appetizers, I kept the conversation flowing, steering clear of anything too personal. I wanted to watch her to see if she'd slip, but Emily was an expert performer. At one point, her phone buzzed on the table, and she quickly flipped it over. I caught a glimpse of the name on the screen before she did. "Marcus. Work?" I asked casually, nodding toward the phone. Her eyes flickered, but she smiled. "Yeah, just a quick follow-up about next week's project." I smiled back, forcing myself to play the fool again. "You work too hard, you know that?" She laughed, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You're sweet. That's why I married you." The words hit like a punch to the gut, but I kept my expression neutral. When we got home that night, Emily went straight to bed, claiming she was exhausted. I stayed up, scrolling through my phone, checking the tracking app I'd installed on her device earlier that day. Her recent locations lit up the map like a trail of breadcrumbs: her office, the gym, that same boutique hotel from the credit card statement. The last ping was from earlier that evening, just before she met me for dinner. Marcus's address. I sat there in the dark, staring at the screen, my heart pounding. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was certainty. But I still needed more. The trap was set. All I had to do now was wait for her to walk right into it. Frank didn't take long to deliver. 2 days later, I got a call while I was at work. His voice was calm, methodical, but what he told me made my stomach churn. "It's worse than you think," he said bluntly. "I've got photos, timestamps, everything you need. Your wife's been meeting this guy regularly, Marcus, right? They're not subtle about it." I gripped the phone so tightly I thought it might snap. "What do you mean by not subtle?" "Meetings at hotels, private dinners, one time at his apartment. It's all here." The word hotels hit me like a sledgehammer. My mind spun as Frank gave me the details, his voice steady and clinical while my chest felt like it was being torn apart. "Do you want me to send over the files?" he asked. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "I'll pick them up." That evening, I told Emily I had to work late. She barely glanced up from her phone, muttering something about how she'd probably go to bed early anyway. By the time I got to Frank's office, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. He handed me a manila envelope, its weight feeling heavier than it should. "Take your time with it," he said, his tone softer now. "This kind of thing, it's not easy." I nodded, but I didn't open the envelope until I was back in my car, parked in an empty lot a few blocks away. My hands trembled as I pulled out the photos. There she was, Emily, sitting across from Marcus at an upscale restaurant, her hand resting on his wrist. Another showed them walking into a hotel lobby, laughing like teenagers sneaking off to break the rules. The timestamps were damning. These were the nights she told me she was with Kara. The last photo was the worst. Taken through the window of Marcus's apartment, it showed Emily leaning in to kiss him, her hand on his chest, her face lit with a softness I hadn't seen in months. I stared at that photo until my vision blurred. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the ease with which she'd done it. The way she'd lied to my face and then come home to me like nothing had happened. By the time I got home, I'd made up my mind. The next big event was 2 days away, a friend's party that Emily had insisted we attend together. I hadn't wanted to go at first, but now it felt like the perfect stage for what I had planned. I spent the next day preparing, piecing together everything I needed to make sure there would be no denying the truth. I wanted everyone to see who Emily really was, to strip away the facade she'd so carefully crafted. When the night of the party arrived, Emily was in high spirits. She wore a sleek black dress that hugged her figure, her makeup flawless, her laugh ringing through the house as she got ready. "Don't you think I look good tonight?" she asked, twirling in front of me. "You look perfect," I said, my voice steady. She didn't notice the edge in my tone. We arrived at the party together, her arm looped through mine, and immediately fell into the flow of mingling and small talk. Emily was in her element, charming everyone around her, while I stayed in the background, waiting for the right moment. And then I saw him, Marcus. He was standing near the bar, talking to a group of people, his presence as smug and self-assured as ever. Emily spotted him too, her smile flickering for the briefest moment before she turned back to me. "I'm going to grab a drink," she said, already heading toward the bar. "Take your time," I replied, watching her go. While she was distracted, I slipped away and approached the event coordinator, a friend of the host who was managing the music and visuals for the night. I handed her a flash drive, leaning in to explain quietly what I needed. "Trust me," I said, my voice firm. "You're going to want to play this." She hesitated but eventually nodded, her curiosity getting the better of her. 10 minutes later, as the lights dimmed and everyone's attention turned toward the screen at the front of the room, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was it. The first image appeared on the screen. Emily and Marcus, sitting too close at a cafe. Then another, showing them walking hand in hand down a quiet street. A murmur rippled through the crowd as the photos kept coming, each one more damning than the last. The final image froze on the screen. Emily kissing Marcus outside his apartment. The room went silent. I didn't wait to see her reaction. As the whispers started and heads turned, I walked out of the room, leaving her to deal with the fallout. The moment I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. But it was my beginning, and I wasn't going to let her lies define me anymore. I was halfway down the street when I heard her shouting my name. Emily's voice cut through the crisp night air like a siren, filled with panic and fury. I didn't turn around, didn't even slow my pace. "Ethan!" she yelled again, louder this time, her heels clicking rapidly on the pavement behind me. She caught up to me near the corner, grabbing my arm and forcing me to stop. Her face was flushed, not from embarrassment but from anger. Her perfect composure had cracked wide open, and the venom underneath was spilling out. "What the hell was that?" she hissed, her nails digging into my sleeve. "You humiliated me in front of everyone. What is wrong with you?" I yanked my arm free, my own fury rising to match hers. "What's wrong with me? Are you serious right now, Emily? Do you think I don't know what you've been doing behind my back? You've been lying to me for months. Do you have any idea how pathetic I felt sitting at home while you were out screwing around with Marcus?" Her eyes widened for a split second before narrowing into a glare. "You're overreacting. Those photos don't prove anything. Don't you dare!" I snapped, my voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare stand here and lie to my face. I know about the hotels. I know about the dinners. I know everything, Emily." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For once, her silver tongue failed her. "You have no idea how much I wanted to believe you," I continued, my voice breaking despite my best efforts to stay composed. "Even when the signs were right in front of me, I told myself I was imagining things. But you didn't even care enough to cover your tracks, did you? You thought I'd never figure it out." She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "And what, Ethan? You think this makes you a hero? Airing our dirty laundry in front of all those people? You didn't just humiliate me. You humiliated yourself." "I don't care about them," I shouted, my voice echoing down the empty street. "This isn't about them. This is about us. Or whatever the hell was left of us before you destroyed it." Her face twisted into a sneer, the anger giving way to something colder. "Oh, don't act so high and mighty. You've been boring for years, Ethan. You're predictable, safe. And honestly, I needed more. Marcus made me feel alive again. Something you haven't done in a long time." Her words hit like a slap, but instead of hurting, they fueled the fire inside me. "And what about the vows you made? Or were those just words to you? You don't get to rewrite history and blame me for your choices, Emily." She rolled her eyes, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Oh, please, spare me the righteous act. You were never going to leave me, Ethan. You're too weak. You don't have the guts to do anything about it, which is why I'm not even worried." That was it. The breaking point. I stepped back, shaking my head. You know what, Emily? You're right. I have been weak. But not anymore. Her smirk faltered as I turned and walked away, my steps steady and resolute. I didn't look back this time. I didn't need to. The weight that had been crushing me for months was gone. And as I rounded the corner and the sound of her voice faded into the distance, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to before. I wasn't the one who had lost something that night. She was. The house was dead silent when I got home. The kind of silence that presses down on you, thick and suffocating. Emily hadn't followed me, which wasn't a surprise. She'd never been one to face consequences unless she was forced to. I stood in the entryway for a moment, staring at the space we'd built together. The walls were covered in photos of vacations, family gatherings, and celebrations, an elaborate lie in glossy frames. I wanted to rip them all down, to erase every trace of the life we'd shared. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I went upstairs, pulled a duffel bag from the closet, and started packing. The methodical act of folding clothes and tossing them into the bag felt grounding, like the first step toward reclaiming control. For every shirt I packed, a memory surfaced. Some sweet, some bitter. The honeymoon in Hawaii, the night we fought about money, the quiet evenings we used to spend watching movies in bed. By the time the bag was full, my emotions were a tangled knot of anger, grief, and a strange, growing sense of freedom. As I zipped it up, I heard the front door slam. Heavy footsteps followed, echoing up the stairs. Ethan. Emily's voice was sharp, brittle. I didn't respond. She appeared in the doorway moments later, still in her party dress, her makeup smeared and her expression stormy. What are you doing? I didn't look at her as I hoisted the bag onto my shoulder. What does it look like? You're leaving, she scoffed, her voice dripping with disbelief. Oh, come on. Don't be so dramatic. We had a fight, big deal. That doesn't mean you pack up and run away like some coward. Her words barely registered. I brushed past her, heading for the stairs. Ethan, she snapped, grabbing my arm. Her grip was firm, but her voice cracked, betraying the edge of desperation beneath the anger. Can you stop for 1 second and talk to me? I turned to face her, meeting her eyes for the first time since the party. Talk about what, Emily? About how you've been cheating on me for months. Or about how you lied to my face every single day while I tried to hold us together. What exactly do you want to discuss? She flinched, but her defiance returned just as quickly. You're blowing this out of proportion. It's not like I wanted to hurt you, Ethan. It just happened. And maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have had to go looking elsewhere. Her audacity stunned me. For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process how she could stand there and twist the knife even further. You're unbelievable, I said finally, my voice cold. You've burned this to the ground, and instead of owning it, you're trying to make it my fault. Do you even hear yourself? Her expression wavered, a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, crossing her face. I made a mistake, okay? But we can fix this. We've been through worse before. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. No, Emily, you made a choice. Over and over again. And the only thing I regret is not seeing you for who you really are sooner. She stepped back, her arms wrapping around herself defensively. So that's it? You're just walking away. For once, yeah, I said, turning toward the stairs. I am. As I reached the front door, she called after me one last time. Ethan, if you leave, you'll regret it. I paused, hand on the doorknob, and looked back at her. The only thing I regret is wasting 6 years of my life with someone who didn't value them. The door closed behind me with a finality that felt like ripping off a bandage. I didn't know where I was going yet. Maybe a hotel, maybe to crash on a friend's couch. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward, and I wasn't looking back. The first night away from Emily was strange. I ended up at a small motel on the edge of town, the same one I'd stayed at after the fallout at the party. The room was quiet, almost eerily so, and I spent most of the evening sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me like a lead blanket. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was the realization of how much I'd let myself shrink in that relationship. I'd spent years bending over backward to keep things steady, to make her happy, And for what? To be lied to, gaslit, and tossed aside like I was disposable. By midnight, I decided I needed to do something, anything, to distract myself. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling aimlessly until I landed on a text thread with my best friend, Greg. He'd been my rock over the years, but we drifted lately, mostly because Emily always seemed to need my time more than anyone else. "Hey, you up?" I typed, hitting send before I could second-guess it. The response came almost instantly. "Dude, yeah, heard about the party. You okay?" I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "Not really. Can I come over?" 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Greg's living room, nursing a beer and spilling everything. He listened without interrupting, his expression shifting between shock and quiet rage as I recounted the lies, the photos, and the way she tried to blame me for everything. "Man," he said finally, leaning back on the couch. "I knew something was off with her, but this? I didn't see it coming." "Me neither," I admitted, staring into my beer. "She played me, Greg. I feel like an idiot." "You're not an idiot," he said firmly. "She's just a damn good liar. But look at it this way, now you're free. You don't have to put up with her crap anymore." The word free stuck with me. I hadn't felt free in a long time, and it was a strange, almost foreign sensation. "What do I do now?" I asked, my voice quieter. Greg shrugged. "Whatever the hell you want. You don't owe her anything, Ethan. Go live your life. Reconnect with the people who actually care about you. Hell, pick up a hobby or take a trip. Just don't let her drag you down anymore." His words hit home. For so long, my life had revolved around keeping Emily happy, solving her problems, and smoothing over her chaos. I'd forgotten what it felt like to make choices for myself. That night, I slept on Greg's couch, and for the first time in months, I didn't wake up feeling like I was drowning. The next morning, I called my boss and took a few days off work. Then I made a list. Small things at first, like cleaning out my emails and canceling subscriptions Emily had insisted we keep. But as the list grew, so did my resolve. I called a lawyer that afternoon. "I want to file for divorce," I said firmly. The woman on the other end of the line didn't ask for details, just walked me through the initial steps. It was surprisingly straightforward, and by the time I hung up, I felt lighter. The paperwork would take time, but just knowing the process was in motion gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in months. The next few days were a blur of logistics. I moved my things out of the house while Emily was at work, leaving a note on the kitchen counter. "This is your mess to clean up now. Don't contact me unless it's about the divorce." I changed the passwords on all our joint accounts, canceled her access to my credit cards, and blocked her number. The separation wasn't just physical. It was total. Every step I took away from her felt like shedding a layer of skin, raw and uncomfortable but necessary. By the end of the week, I was staying in a temporary rental, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I'd bought new sheets, a couch, and a coffee maker that actually worked. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For the first time in years, I felt like I was building something for myself. It didn't take long for Emily to find a way around the silence I'd imposed. I had blocked her number and cut off her access to my accounts. But she wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily. She thrived on control, and losing it wasn't something she could tolerate. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was unpacking boxes in my rental, trying to piece together some semblance of a new life. The knock on the door came out of nowhere. Sharp, insistent, and completely unwelcome. When I opened it, there she was, Emily. She looked disheveled. Her hair pulled into a loose bun and her makeup smudged like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red, but not from crying. No, this wasn't sadness. It was anger, frustration, and something else. Desperation, maybe. "Ethan," she said, her voice clipped. "We need to talk." I didn't respond, gripping the edge of the door instead. "There's nothing to talk about, Emily. I made that clear." She let out a bitter laugh, pushing past me before I could stop her. "Oh, come on. You think you can just walk away from 6 years of marriage without a conversation? You owe me more than that." I closed the door behind her, my jaw tightening. "What I owed you was loyalty, respect, and honesty. I gave you all of that, and you threw it back in my face. I don't owe you a damn thing anymore." She turned to face me, her eyes blazing. You're acting like I'm the only one who's made mistakes. Like you're some kind of saint. But you weren't perfect, Ethan. You were distant, boring, predictable. You let me feel invisible, and Marcus. Don't, I interrupted sharply, my voice cutting through the air like a whip. Don't you dare say his name in my house. Not after everything you've done. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of my words sinking in. But Emily wasn't the type to back down. Fine, she said, crossing her arms. You want to hate me? Go ahead. But let's not pretend you're some kind of victim here. Relationships take two people, and you weren't exactly pulling your weight. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You really can't take responsibility for anything, can you? You cheated, Emily. You lied to me for months. And instead of owning up to it, you're standing here trying to blame me for your choices. Her face twisted, the mask of composure slipping entirely. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. I cut her off, stepping closer. You wanted excitement. You wanted attention. And instead of talking to me, instead of giving me the chance to fix things, you decided to burn everything to the ground. That's on you, Emily. Not me. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. For the first time, she seemed at a loss. I've already filed for divorce, I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions roiling inside me. You can fight it if you want, but I'm done. We're done. Her eyes widened, the reality of my words hitting her like a slap. You're serious? Dead serious? I said, crossing my arms. Now, unless you have something productive to say, you need to leave. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. Maybe she didn't. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the closed door. The air felt heavy, but underneath the weight of everything, there was a flicker of relief. She was gone, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The silence after Emily left was deafening. For days, it felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter the fragile calm. But nothing did. I'd expected more from her. A tantrum, maybe, or another calculated attempt to worm her way back into my life. Instead, there was nothing. No texts, no emails, no showing up unannounced. It felt like the eye of a storm, the stillness before the chaos returned. In the meantime, I tried to rebuild. I threw myself into work, tackling projects I'd neglected while my marriage was crumbling. My coworkers noticed the shift. Looking good, man, one of them said during a lunch break. You seem lighter. Yeah, I replied with a tight smile. Just cleaning house, you know? But the truth was more complicated. While the relief of cutting ties with Emily was real, it didn't erase the ache of betrayal. Every quiet moment was an opportunity for my mind to wander, replaying the lies she'd told, the nights I'd spent waiting for her to come home, the photos of her with Marcus. And then there were the people, friends, acquaintances, even strangers from the party, all with opinions, questions, and unsolicited advice. You did the right thing, one friend told me over drinks. She didn't deserve you. Man, I don't know how you stayed so calm, another said. If it were me, I would have lost it. I nodded along, pretending their words helped, but in truth, they didn't. None of it did. One evening, about a week after Emily's visit, I got a call from Frank, the private investigator. Just wanted to give you a heads up, he said. Marcus is out of the picture. What do you mean? I asked, sitting up straighter. Word is he's skipping town. Too much heat. Something about his other affairs catching up to him. Looks like your wife wasn't his only problem. I didn't know how to feel about that. On one hand, it was poetic justice. Marcus had built his life on lies, and now it was crumbling. But on the other hand, it left a bitter taste in my mouth. Emily had destroyed our marriage for a man who didn't even have the decency to stick around. After hanging up with Frank, I stared at my phone for a long time, debating whether to let Emily know. Not to gloat, but to, what? Offer her closure? Remind her of the disaster she'd chosen? No, that wasn't my job anymore. Instead, I opened the contacts on my phone and deleted her number. It felt symbolic, even if I still knew it by heart. That night, as I sat on my couch, sipping a glass of whiskey, I realized I didn't miss her. Not really. I missed the idea of what we'd had, the version of her I thought I knew. But that person was gone, if she'd ever existed at all. The next day, I booked a trip. Nothing extravagant, just a cabin by the lake a few hours away. I needed to get out of the city, away from the memories that clung to every street corner and coffee shop. As I packed, I found myself smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. The pain was still there, a dull ache that would take time to fade, but so was something else. Hope. It was time to start living for myself again. The drive to the cabin felt like shedding an old skin. Mile after mile, the city shrank behind me, replaced by open roads, rolling hills, and dense clusters of trees painted in autumn hues. The air smelled different out here. Cleaner, crisper, untouched by the exhaust and noise of daily life. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, secluded enough that I couldn't hear anything but the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had everything I needed. A bed, a fireplace, and a view of the lake that stretched out like a mirror under the pale blue sky. I set my bags down and stood at the edge of the dock, staring out at the water. For the first time in weeks, my mind was quiet. The first day passed in a haze of simplicity. I unpacked, went for a walk along the trails, and spent the evening sitting by the fire with a book I hadn't touched in years. The ache of betrayal lingered, but it felt distant here, like a shadow I could ignore. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself replaying moments from my marriage. Not the bad ones, but the good ones. Our first date, when she'd ordered dessert before dinner just to see if I'd match her energy. The road trip to Colorado, when we'd gotten lost and ended up in a tiny diner that served the best pie we'd ever had. It hurt to remember, but it also reminded me of something important. I'd been happy before, and if I'd been happy once, I could be happy again. The next morning, I woke up early and made a pot of coffee, sipping it on the porch as the sun rose over the lake. The stillness of the moment was overwhelming in the best way, like the world was pressing pause just for me. By the third day, I started to feel lighter. I spent hours hiking, my legs burning as I climbed steep trails that offered stunning views of the surrounding forest. At night, I wrote in a journal I'd picked up on a whim, pouring out every thought and feeling I'd buried over the past few months. The act of writing was cathartic, even if the words felt messy and raw. I wrote about the pain of betrayal, the anger at being lied to, and the bittersweet realization that I'd been clinging to a version of Emily that no longer existed. But I also wrote about the future, what I wanted, who I wanted to be, and the kind of life I wanted to build now that I was free. On the last night at the cabin, I sat by the lake under a sky filled with stars, thinking about the road ahead. I didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time, that didn't scare me. I was done looking back. When I left the cabin the next morning, I didn't feel the same heaviness I'd arrived with. Instead, I felt a quiet resolve, like a seed planted deep inside me, ready to grow. The road home was long, but this time, it felt like I was driving toward something instead of running away. Coming back to the city felt different this time. The streets were the same, the buildings unchanged, but I wasn't. The days at the cabin had peeled away the layers of bitterness and hurt, leaving something raw but real beneath. I wasn't healed, not yet, but I was no longer drowning. I returned to my rental, the space still bare but comforting in its simplicity. It didn't carry the weight of old memories or the shadows of betrayal. It was just mine. I spent the next few days piecing my life back together in small ways. I started running again, pounding the pavement early in the mornings when the city was just waking up. The rhythm of my feet hitting the ground was meditative, a reminder that I was still moving forward, even if the pace was slow. At work, I focused harder than ever, pouring myself into projects and meetings. My boss noticed. "You've been on fire lately," she said during a team meeting. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." I nodded, offering a small smile. Work wasn't just a distraction anymore. It was a foundation, something I could rely on when everything else had fallen apart. But it wasn't all easy. There were moments when the loneliness hit me like a freight train, the silence of my new life feeling less like peace and more like a void. I'd find myself reaching for my phone, my thumb hovering over Emily's name before I forced myself to stop. She didn't contact me again after that last encounter, and I was grateful for the distance. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through emails, I saw an invitation for a friend's birthday party. Normally, I would have declined, but something about it made me pause. I'd spent so much time retreating from the world, pulling away from people who cared about me because I was too wrapped up in my own pain. Maybe it was time to change that. When the night of the party arrived, I found myself standing outside a bustling bar, the sound of laughter and music spilling onto the sidewalk. I hesitated, my hand on the door, wondering if I was ready to dive back into social life. Ethan? I turned to see a familiar face. Sarah, an old friend from college. She smiled, her expression warm and genuine. I thought that was you, she said, stepping closer. It's been ages. How've you been? I shrugged, offering a half-smile. You know, life happens. She laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Doesn't it always? Come on, let's get a drink. Inside, the bar was packed, but Sarah weaved through the crowd with ease, leading me to a small group of familiar faces. The conversation flowed easily, filled with jokes and shared memories. For the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed without forcing it. As the night wore on, Sarah leaned over, her voice quieter now. It's really good to see you, Ethan. You seem different, in a good way. I looked at her, the sincerity in her eyes catching me off guard. Thanks, I said. I'm trying. She smiled, lifting her glass. To trying. To trying? I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. That night, as I walked home through the cool night air, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and for the first time in a long time, I was okay with not knowing exactly what came next. The weeks that followed the party felt like the beginning of something new, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what. Life didn't suddenly fall into place or transform into some picture-perfect version of itself, but it started to feel manageable. I reached out to people I hadn't spoken to in years, friends, colleagues, even family members I'd drifted away from. The conversations were awkward at first, but slowly, the connections I thought I'd lost began to rebuild. One weekend, I went to visit my parents, something I hadn't done in months. My mom hugged me tighter than usual when I walked through the door. You look good, she said, studying me with a softness in her eyes. Lighter. I smiled at her, the words settling somewhere deep inside me. On the surface, my life wasn't extraordinary. I woke up, went to work, exercised, and spent quiet evenings with a book or a show. But underneath the routine, there was a steady hum of possibility, like the beginning of a song I hadn't yet learned how to sing. Sarah and I started texting occasionally after the party. At first, it was just casual stuff, jokes about work, recommendations for books and movies. But over time, the conversations grew deeper. We talked about college, about the people we used to be and the ways we changed. One night, as we sat in a coffee shop, she asked, "Do you think you'll ever trust someone again? After everything?" The question hung in the air, heavy but not unwelcome. I don't know, I admitted. I think it'll take time, but I want to. Her smile was small but encouraging. That's a good place to start. The divorce was finalized a month later. The day I signed the papers, I didn't feel sadness or regret, just relief. Emily didn't fight it, and the process was cleaner than I'd expected. She sent a short email afterward, thanking me for handling it maturely. I didn't respond. It wasn't anger that stopped me this time. It was clarity. I didn't owe her anything anymore. Not my time, not my thoughts, not even my words. To celebrate, I did something I never would have done before. I booked a ticket to Europe. It was impulsive and a little reckless, but it felt right. I'd always wanted to see Italy, to wander through Rome's ancient streets and sit on a terrace overlooking the Tuscan hills. When I told Sarah about the trip, she grinned. That's amazing. You deserve this. Thanks, I said, feeling the weight of her words. The day before I left, I stood in my new apartment, staring at the empty walls. There were no pictures, no remnants of the life I'd left behind. And for the first time, I was okay with that. This was my blank slate, my chance to start over. As the plane took off the next morning, I looked out the window, the city shrinking below me. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but full of promise. I wasn't sure where this journey would lead, but for the first time in a long time, I was ready to find out. And that was enough.